Um, oh, that's going to be all me. Here we go. Hey, Chan, how are you doing? You're calling from Shreveport, Louisiana, and called in about miracles and stuff. How can John and I help you?
Hey, Matt. Hey, John.
Hey, Chan.
Just wanted to, last week we were talking about the concept of miracles, and you asked a question, and I thought about it a little bit more, and you asked, how could we confirm a miracle? And that's a great question. And I guess what I wanted to ask you is, what do you mean by confirm?
I think we kind of talked about this earlier. So there's two parts to this. One, you would need to be able to reasonably confirm that the event happened. You know,
Okay.
Hey, my uncle lost his arm in the war, and we have all the records for this and the doctors, and we've got video evidence, and we've seen him, and now he has an arm that has just grown back. And since that would definitely fit as something that we would generally identify as a miracle, then I think that we could reasonably confirm that the event happened. The second question is, how do you then explain the event? How do you get to what caused his limb to miraculously grow back? And for that, I can't give you a clear way to confirm it, because it's the sort of thing that I don't see any path to be able to confirm it. Somebody would have to come up with a method by which we could confirm the explanation.
Okay, fair enough. And last week when I called you, I mentioned the hypothetical about the beheaded pastor. Do you remember that?
Yep.
Okay, so what if I gave, I think as a Christian, I don't think we should automatically go right to the miraculous. I have no problem looking for a natural explanation. So I think that, in order to call something a miracle, I think three things have to happen. So I'm going to lay this out and you tell me what you think. Number one, it needs to be a highly improbable event. Number two, it needs to lack a natural explanation. And number three, it needs to have a religious context surrounding it.
Why? So I object to number two and number three. Me too. Yeah, okay, John does too, so I'll let John object to him.
I object to number two and number three.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So my illustration last week was about the beheaded pastor. There's ISIS comes in front of the whole congregation. They cut his head off in front of everybody. The coroner comes in. He picks up the head. They do a blood test. It was definitely, he was murdered. He was buried.
Sure. Let me pause this, Chan. I apologize for interrupting you, because we don't need to rehash this. I will say one point I would like to try to get to before we're done is, why is it every time we talk about this, theists come up with this absolutely bizarre scenario that has never happened and which they can provide no comparable case to? A pastor beheaded who comes back to life a little later, a limb growing back. We can agree that these sorts of things would certainly lead us that direction, and yet we can also agree that those things have never happened. But before we get to that, I want John to be able to talk about why he objects to items 2 and 3 in your definition.
Well, number two,
go right ahead.
Number two, as I recall, had something to do with it doesn't have a natural explanation, and that
it lacks
a natural explanation, and that's going into proven a negative territory. So my objection is, how would you determine that it lacks a natural explanation, or are you just saying you can't think of a natural explanation?
No, I'm saying not that you can't think of a natural explanation, but that no natural explanation will work.
Okay, so here's the problem with that. You've just made your entire thing circular. Because in order to say there is no natural explanation, you would need to demonstrate that there's no natural explanation, which means you would have to have godlike knowledge of every possible explanation.
Yeah, how do you prove that?
All your second criteria is it has no natural explanation is equivalent to is necessarily supernatural. And that's those two things are identical. Has no natural explanation is identical to is supernatural.
But I think you're thinking that I'm getting to the point that if I was to call it a miracle, that I have to get to 100% certainty, and that's not necessarily
No,
the case.
I'm not worried about 100% certainty. We went by what you just said when John questioned your second criterion. Because to say that it has no natural explanation, that is an injection of certainty there. That is because otherwise you're just simply saying we don't currently have a natural explanation for it. Your definition requires that we rule out any possible naturalistic explanation.
But it's not just that second point.
But if the second one's wrong, your definition has a problem. That's the point. And your third one, your third definition, that it requires some sort of supernatural context. You have
religious context.
Religious context. Yeah.
So if a person's head was chopped off and came back, but it wasn't a pastor in a church, are you saying that wouldn't be a miracle?
Well, it depends. I mean, yeah, if the person came back.
What do you mean it depends? If we're out here and a guy walking down the street gets hit by a car and his head rolls off, and 2 days later he gets back up and there was no religious context to any of it, you're saying that's not a miracle?
Well, that probably would be a miracle.
Okay, yeah, then your definition of a miracle is flawed. Definitely, you agree on point 3, and we think on points 2 and 3. So we're not going to work with your definition of miracle.
Okay, so what definition of miracle would you accept? Because in order to say something is a miracle, we got to have some kind of definition. And all miracles, if they occur, are on a case-by-case basis.
Sure.
People should investigate them on a case-by-case basis. That's why there's no set rule to say this is a miracle or this is not a miracle. We have to investigate those claims and see what evidence is brought forth to say that it's a miracle. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and that gets back to your number 2 again, is that if you go to investigate, okay, why did this limb grow back? And when you investigate, you come up with some naturalistic explanation for how this happened, then do you no longer call it a miracle? Or is it just that you understand something that you didn't understand before? You know, as we get more and more advanced, do things that were miracles become not miracles anymore?
Well, and that's by definition, a miracle is a rare event.
Okay.
It's a rare,
and
that's why it's investigated.
The miracles are wholly unimpressive, and the only thing that we're concerned about is what is the explanation for miracle, because there's all kinds of rare events and unlikely events. And if you want to say, I mean, I think the normative definition of a miracle is anything that is unexpected upon our understanding of how the natural world works, something that seems to be in conflict with the natural order. I don't even know that there's a discussion of how likely it is, because if pastors were being beheaded and coming back to life every 2 or 3 days, now it would become a regular event and almost expected, and it would still count as miraculous because it's in violation of the natural order. Now, this isn't saying that that there isn't. Basically, this definition of miracle gets to what John was saying. Today, we're going to label this a miracle. We may find out that there's a perfectly acceptable naturalistic explanation sometime in the future, in which case we would go back and look at this and say, okay, we thought it was a miracle, but it turns out it's actually part of the natural order. We just found something new and unexpected that didn't fit with what we understood. And this is why the whole definition of a miracle, an example of miracle, is secondary to the big claim, which is miracles. First of all, that a miracle has occurred, which I see, or a miracle which can be tied to a supernatural cause has occurred. I see no evidence for that at all.
It seems like to me that you're moving the goalpost.
I'm not moving the goalposts. I'm putting them where they should. It is the people who want to say that because something unusual or rare or unexpected has happened, that therefore they are justified in thinking that a supernatural being has intervened. They have moved the goalposts into the land of gullibility. I am putting them where they should be from an objective status, where we don't begin with the assumption that there is a being who can do this.
No, I think a theist, I should look for a natural explanation first.
Okay, and when you don't find one, what do you do then?
Well, my worldview allows for a supernatural explanation because I don't think.
Okay, I understand, but what if your worldview allows for fairies? What does that tell me about your worldview?
Well, my worldview doesn't allow for fairies, but
you just allowed for supernatural. Aren't fairies supernatural?
I guess.
Okay, so how come you're excluding fairies from your supernatural worldview?
I haven't had any evidence of fairies, but
okay.
If someone brings
so you're excluding supernatural things that you don't have evidence for. What supernatural things do you have evidence for?
What supernatural things do I have evidence for?
Yeah.
Is that, okay. And this goes back to the classical arguments for God's existence. And you're very familiar with those. The cosmological argument.
Not evidence for the supernatural.
There's evidence for a cause of the universe.
No.
And that, okay, and through Big Bang cosmology, we know that the universe began to exist.
Actually, we don't know that. We don't know that. And the current trend among scientists is to actually point out that the universe did not have a beginning in space-time. That space-time didn't begin to exist, and that's from Hawking, from Alan Guth. Sean Carroll's talked about it, exposed this when he debated William Lane Craig, because William Lane Craig gets up and says that the Borg-Guth-Vilenkin model supports his idea that the universe had a beginning and everything else, and Carroll explained why that was all wrong, and then had an actual picture of Alan Guth basically holding up a sign that says, Craig doesn't understand my model and is misusing it, although it had actually different words. So the Kalam cosmological argument is fundamentally flawed, but at the end, the conclusion of the Kalam of the universe having a beginning, a cause, does not mean that the cause is supernatural. Even if it were correct, it would not be evidence for the supernatural. But it's not correct. So using it is even doubly wrong.
You're right. I can't force you to accept the conclusion of the Kalam.
Why is it, Chan, that it was really simple for you to say your model accepts the supernatural and excludes fairies because you don't have evidence for them? And then when asked, what evidence do you have for the supernatural, you go to this abstract argument, which doesn't actually prove the supernatural and is also flawed. Where's the actual evidence for the supernatural?
The resurrection of Jesus.
How do you know the resurrection occurred? You don't get to just cite a story in a book and say this is evidence of the supernatural. What did you do with all the other dying and rising saviors that were popular? Did they rise from the dead?
Those are copycats.
Okay, how do you know that?
Because I've done some research on it, and I've looked into it, and I've read some of the writings. I just did an entire debate on the resurrection with Blake Junta in Dallas, and then he came down to my house, and we sat on the couch and we talked about this. Blake acknowledges that in order to conclude that the resurrection occurred, you have to begin with the assumption that the resurrection is something that a God would do. So you have to begin with a God belief and that God would do it. And apart from that, you cannot reach the conclusion that Jesus rose from the dead. So that makes this argument circular. If you're trying to use the resurrection to confirm the supernatural, but you have to accept the supernatural before you can possibly make any sort of argument for the resurrection, then the argument is circular. Here's the problem. Here's the problem. There is no empirical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Zip, nada, zilch, zero, and there could not be. So if that's you're talking about a past event,
right?
And when you have a past event, then we must investigate it through historical claims.
Right, and historians cannot confirm miracles by definition. That is a violation of historical methods. Bart Ehrman has pointed this out a gazillion times, that a miracle by definition is the least probable explanation, and no good historian could look at an event in history and say that the least probable explanation is actually the most probable one and is confirmed. Historians cannot do that. That is a violation of historical practices. Historians cannot confirm miracles. All they can do is say, yeah, hey, there's a bunch of people who said this happened, and we think we have reliable reports, and maybe some of them are eyewitnesses. But that doesn't confirm miracle. That doesn't confirm supernatural. There's no evidence for this, no empirical evidence for it.
The problem with what you just said, Matt, about the least probable thing is you're using a relative frequency model to disprove this, but we can
I'm not disproving it. I'm not disproving it. I'm pointing out that it is not rational to accept that it happened.
Okay. Well, let's take your example, and we would say that it is very rare that countries drop nuclear bombs on other countries. It hasn't happened before World War II, and it hasn't happened since. But propaganda happens all the time. So according to your logic, we should take that when the U.S. dropped nuclear bombs on Japan, that was propaganda. The problem with the relatively frequency model is that there's one thing that trumps that, and that is evidence.
Yes. And you know what we have for dropping the bomb on Japan? Evidence, both in reports for people who were on our side and for people who were on the other side. We have measurements of radioactivity. We have the evidence of the destruction. We have people who have suffered because of it. We have mountains of empirical evidence for this. And we have nothing remotely like that for the resurrection. And here's the major problem. Let's say, Chan, you're God now instead of Zane. And you come down and you take human form, and you decide that you're going to give up a weekend and play dead as a way to serve as a loophole for rules that you evidently created or that are part of you. And you go through all this, and then you say it is absolutely critical that for anybody to get to the good place, they have to accept that this happened and then change their life based on that acceptance. And then you offer zero empirical evidence for the claim, so that nobody who wasn't actually there could be even close to reasonably justified that a miracle occurred. What kind of God does that make you?
That caricature that you have of salvation is, I can't say what I would do as a God, but what you're assuming is that God only cares if you believe in him.
I didn't. No, you didn't listen to me, Chan. I said that it was conditioned that he wanted people to accept that and then change their lives based on that. You don't get to tell me that my model is based on just belief when I just explained in detail. I understand this stuff. And I can tell you, even though you can't answer, what I would do if I was God. First of all, I'd never have that bizarre human sacrifice blood cult scenario in the first place. But if I did, I would provide clear evidence for the position. If this is true, that Jesus died for our sins and was resurrected, if this is true, it is the single most important event that ever happened in the history of the world.
Agreed.
And if it happened, and my afterlife is conditioned on what I think of that and how it affects my life, no good God, no reasonably intelligent God could ever construct a scenario where we have copies of translations of copies of hearsay accounts written decades after the purported events as the best supporting evidence with no empirical evidence, nothing to support it. There's better evidence for UFOs visiting Earth, and I think that's a crock, than there is for Jesus resurrecting. No God who actually cares or was reasonably intelligent would set up this scenario. Only someone who doesn't understand rational thought and doesn't care about rational thought could ever judge someone based on rejecting this unsubstantiated claim.
Matt, I've taken up enough of your time. I don't know what Blake's case was for the resurrection.
You can watch it. His case was that the author of Luke Acts, which he called Fred, because we don't know who it was reliable. And that the best explanation for apostles soon after the resurrection claiming that Jesus visited them was that he was actually resurrected. That was his argument.
How did he know that Fred was reliable?
He used Luke and Acts. Is that what you said?
Yeah, the author of Luke and Acts is the same person, generally considered to be. Right. So, and he called him Fred because we don't know who that person is. We just generally, there are certain writing distinctions that show that Luke and Acts are essentially by the same author.
But if you and I,
go ahead.
in my case, the resurrection is actually earlier. I would have used 1 Corinthians 15, which is actually
he pointed
earlier.
to 1 Corinthians 15 as well, because that's where the creed begins. But
Right.
what that is a
And
claim.
that's
That is not evidence for something. That is a claim of something. What I'm looking
Right.
for is
So-
evidence for the claim.
Well, what I'm saying is that case is a little bit earlier, and there is a historical bedrock that a good number of scholars accept surrounding the life of Jesus. If you were to just look at the Gospels, not as a religious text, but as a historical text, most scholars would agree that Jesus, a man named Jesus, did die by crucifixion.
Do you know why? Do you know why? Because most scholars give the benefit of the doubt to the fact that if somebody is portrayed as being a real historical figure, then they were. That is a flaw in historical methods that generally doesn't cause any problems, because most of the time when somebody's talked about as a historical person, they were. But it doesn't work in other situations. Now, I'd highly recommend you watch the debate between me and Blake. Just search for Dillahunty Junta, Giunta, resurrection, and you'll find it, because Blake gave his case, and then I demolish the Gospels. And I also talk about the limits of what historians can show, because at most, and here's a great example. Let's say I tell you that John told me he was just abducted by aliens. Do you believe that John was abducted by aliens based on my say-so?
Based on your say-so?
Right.
Probably not.
Probably not. Cool. Now, let's say I wrote this account down, and 1,000 years from now, historians look back and find this account that I've written. What can they reasonably conclude? If they're able to investigate thoroughly, they can reasonably conclude that I accurately relayed the information that John presented to me, and they may be able to conclude, if there are other reports and things like that, that John sincerely relayed information to me as accurately as he could. But they could never demonstrate that John was actually abducted by aliens. It's not possible. Right?
Right.
Thank you. Please replace John with the Gospel of John and aliens with Jesus resurrected, and you will have the argument that you just agreed demolishes the historical ability to confirm the resurrection. The real argument that Blake and others are presenting is John, the best explanation for why John thinks he was abducted by aliens is that he was actually abducted by aliens, that we should consider him an honest record, and it would be stupid of John to lie. He might make himself a martyr. This is the reliability of the witnesses, the reliability of the apostles' argument, and it is fundamentally flawed as a pathway to the truth. All you're saying is I believe that they're truthful and accurate, which is irrelevant to whether they actually are.
But the problem you gave with the John being abducted by aliens is that you were just a single source. If there were multiple sources and they were independent,
so let's say everybody on the other side of the class, John told this story to them too, and they all wrote it down. Does that make John's story any more accurate?
All right, but let's say that 4 of those people were eyewitnesses to John.
Sure.
Let's say that they were eyewitnesses to the alien account.
Yep.
And therefore, they wrote it down through.
No. You don't get to put down that eyewitnesses wrote it down, because we have no recordings from any eyewitnesses. Everything about this is hearsay written decades afterwards.
No, Paul was an eyewitness.
No, Paul wasn't an eyewitness. Paul wasn't an eyewitness. Jesus had been dead and supposedly resurrected for a long time and Paul was running around persecuting Christians. Paul had a vision. Yeah. He wasn't a witness for the resurrection. He had a vision.
You're right. The difference between the disciples' appearance and Paul's is that it was a post-ascension experience, but he claimed to have been visited by the risen Lord. But
I don't care what he claimed. I care if it's true.
But you have to explain Paul's conversion. What would cause him to go from being the biggest persecutor of the church to the church's most able defender?
What caused Cat Stevens to become a Muslim? Was it because Islam is true?
I don't know about Cat Stevens, but you have to be able to explain it. And I'm not saying
No. That's the point, Chan. You don't have to be able to explain it. The answer could be we don't know. When you say that you have to be able to explain it, what you're saying is you can't come up with a naturalistic explanation. Therefore, it's a supernatural explanation that Paul actually had this. And not only do I not think that that is necessarily the case, but then it gets to the point of, if a Damascus Road experience is good enough for Paul, why doesn't God do that for everybody?
That's a great question.
I know it is. And it demolishes
it
demolishes the foundation of this.
No, because you're saying that Jesus had to have appeared to everybody on the planet.
I'm saying that. No, I'm not saying he had to. I'm saying what is the reason? Because when I say why can't Jesus appear to me, what I get from apologists is a bunch of crap. A bunch of crap that is exposed by the fact that they believe that Jesus appeared to Paul. It's exposed by the fact that many of them, I don't know, do you believe that there's a Satan?
Yes, I do.
Okay, so why can't Jesus present himself to me? Or why won't he?
I don't know. He can. Why he doesn't, I have no idea.
Sure.
But let me ask you this.
Do we have any way of confirming that he's ever presented himself to anybody?
The only way we have confirmation of that, and again, it depends on what you mean by confirmation, is what we have recorded in the Gospels.
Yeah, that's not confirmation. That's the claim. The claim is not evidence for the claim. The claim is the claim.
But this is a historical investigation, and
no, it's not. You can't historically confirm the supernatural. All you can confirm is that the accounts are reliable, and then you conclude that because we have an accurate model or an accurate representation of what Paul said, that you believe Paul. Well, I don't believe Paul. Why should I?
But all that says is, it doesn't say anything about the evidence. It just says something about you that
No, the reason I don't believe Paul is because there's not evidence. There's only a claim. It does say something about the evidence. You believe despite the lack of evidence. That's called faith.
No, that's not true. That's not true. Faith,
okay.
The biblical view of faith is not believing in spite of the evidence. That is not what Scripture teaches at all.
It's not. It's not. So faith isn't the evidence of things unseen? Is that not what the Bible says? Faith is the evidence of things unseen? I can pull it up.
Yes, it's Hebrews 11:6, and also
sure.
Hebrews 11:3. It says faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen.
Yes,
right.
You're not getting this, Chan. It says faith is the evidence, not faith is based on evidence. It says faith is the evidence. Faith is the confidence, not the foundation for it. It's saying faith is this, not faith is based on evidence. You know what's based on evidence? Reasonable conclusions. Faith is the excuse people give when they don't have a good reason, because if you have a good reason, you give it. And when I ask what is the good reason to believe something, you either give it or you make an appeal to faith. And when you talk about believing Paul, you're basically saying, I take it on faith that what I understand Paul to have experienced, he actually experienced. You have to take it on faith because you cannot have evidence that Paul actually experienced something, because you can't get into somebody's head to tell what they experienced, and it doesn't get more probable 2,000 years after the events.
All right, Matt, fair enough. Listen, I've had a great conversation. I enjoyed talking with you. You're a lot of fun. You make me think, and hopefully I'll call back another time. I've taken a lot of your time.
We're officially out of time, but I wanted to get you in the edit. So thanks for the call, Chan. I appreciate it.
All right, Matt, take care.
Thank you.
On that, my apologies to the other atheists who didn't get through, and to John, who had to sit here patiently while I did my entire resurrection debate again. You can find that debate online at my YouTube channel, or you can go to patreon.com/atheistdebates, and then all my content's up there. And what you'll find is not only did I do this debate with Blake, but Blake came down and we had a discussion about the debate, and then we had another discussion about methodological naturalism. And it was great. I mean, we're friends, we get along. Anybody who thinks we're not friends can just watch us on the little love seat in my office, engaging for 3+ hours over two discussions. It's the type of thing I enjoy. And by the way, I enjoy the conversations with Chan as well.
Yeah.
But it's entirely frustrating to constantly be engaged with apologists. and I did this with Blake. The example that came up with Blake is, let's say we're sitting in this room and we have no way to investigate what's outside of this room. And Blake came up with an example. He's convinced there's someone on the other side with telekinetic and telepathic powers. How would you demonstrate that? Well, I just got messages from this person and they're going to move things in this room. That's awesome. It's not the end-all be-all of what we would expect, but it's awesome. It is exactly the sort of real, empirical, physical evidence we would expect that would allow us to possibly confirm that there's somebody on the other side of the wall. And when asked what sort of comparable evidence he has for the God that he believes in, well, you know, the fine-tuning of the universe seems to imply that there must have been a fine-tuner, or the Kalam cosmology. No, those are seems to imply. That's like saying if a pencil fell off the table, that seems to imply that there's a telekinetic person in the other room. That's crap. Why is it that people will say, what would it take to convince you? I don't know, but it's not anything super extraordinary as far as the standards go. The extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, yes. But why is it people who believe, when pressed, will talk about good evidence for the telekinetic in the other room and crap evidence for the God that they're willing to bet their life on? Why is it that when we talk about aliens, they immediately get, hey, there's no good reason to believe John. But when we're talking about resurrections, oh, there's good reason to believe Paul. There's good reason to believe the author of Luke Acts, Fred. Despite the fact that, you know, when you go into the other Gospels, for example, Matthew writes about all sorts of things that aren't historically verifiable, like all the dead getting up and marching on Jerusalem, the zombie attack, or maybe not attack. There's no claim that they actually did any harm, but the dead got up out of their graves and marched on Jerusalem, even though it only happened in the Gospel of Matthew. And in the debate, you'll find that I go through each and every one of the Gospels to show how they cannot be reconciled. Who was at the tomb? Who was at the tomb when? Who told who? When did Peter get there? What happened? All of these things are contradictions. And the answer from the apologists is, well, that's exactly what you would expect if this was true and you had different people relaying the information. There's little things that they're going to get a little wrong, but they're all basically reporting that there was an empty tomb, so there must have been. No, there mustn't. That's something that needs to be demonstrated. It is the claim. Authors writing hearsay accounts decades after the event. When Elvis died for my sins, he stayed dead. And despite the fact that Elvis died, there were immediately claims that he was alive and spotted at convenience stores and rest areas and wherever else you could. And none of those claims are confirmation that Elvis actually didn't die, let alone that Elvis rose from the dead. We can't keep hanging our reason on a claim of reasonable faith. Faith is the excuse people give when they don't have a good reason. And I understand it. I'm not bashing the people who do it. We all do it. The difference is that some of us make extra efforts to expunge that sort of faith-like thinking from our life because we recognize how unreliable it is. I could take it on faith that I'm a better person than John. I'm probably not. But I could take it on faith that I am. I could take it on faith that white people are superior to every other person. I could take it on faith that Hinduism is true. I could take it on faith that ball caps are better than cowboy hats, that pickup trucks are better than Priuses. Are any of those true? Who knows? But faith isn't the way to find out, because faith isn't a pathway to truth. Faith isn't a mechanism. It's not evidence. Despite what the Bible actually says, it isn't the evidence or any evidence. Faith is the appeal when we're out of reasonable explanations.